Time. Time doesn't stop. No matter what you do, you can't stop time from flowing. It won't stop. But what time does do is forget. The bad events become bad memories, which become bad dreams, which fade into the smallest of dark stains on history. This is good. This is natural. This buries things that should be buried, that must be buried for the world's sake. And the worst thing you can do is to go around digging those things up, making time remember what should be forgotten for eternity. I live in New Mexico, out in the country. I never get bored with the outdoors. There's so many weird rock formations to climb, so much odd geography to explore. But the one thing that interests me most about where I live is the archaeology. Hundreds and hundreds of years ago, this area was colonized by Native Americans, known as the Anasazi. The word is actually Navajo, meaning ancient ones or ancient enemy. They built cities out of stone, sometimes sprawling across the ground, sometimes built into the sides of cliffs. I saw some of the biggest ones at Chaco Canyon. That's what captured my interest to begin with. If you ever see them, you'll know what I mean. There's just something about those strange circular structures that fills you with a sense of awe. But now, those cities have been ground down by the wind. They're little more than ruins anymore. That's because they were abandoned long ago. No one knows what happened to the people who live there. They just all vanished, leaving nothing but ruins and a few pottery shards. There have been theories, of course, that it was drought or famine that drove them away, but I never liked that explanation. It just didn't seem right. 1 week after my 16th birthday, I went out and got my driver's license. I was thrilled. Finally, total freedom. That weekend, me and some friends decided to go on a camping trip out in the hills. So Saturday morning, I picked everyone up and we headed out. After a few hours of driving, we found a place that was secluded enough. Stopping the car, we decided to stretch our legs a little before setting up camp. We were parked at the end of a small valley with hills rising up on 3 sides. Deciding to explore a little, we climbed up the nearest one. Getting to the top, we were greeted with an amazing sight. It was a ring of large hills with an enormous depression in the center. Rising out of that depression was the oddest mountain I'd ever seen. The half on the far side from us was normal, rising up at a steep slope. Facing us, however, the mountain came out into a huge overhang, obscuring our vision of what lay beneath. We looked at each other, and then started sliding our way down towards it. Upon reaching the bottom, we were greeted by an even more impressive sight. It was a huge Anasazi city spread out under the overhang. Better yet, it looked almost completely undamaged, located in such a place as to be perfectly sheltered by the wind. Looking at it, I knew that we were the first people to see it in hundreds of years. As excited as I was, something made me hesitant to explore. I don't know what it was, but after a few seconds it had passed and I was jogging forward towards the ruins. Seeing the city as it had been originally built was amazing. I thought of how useful it would be to studying their culture. The one thing that put me off, though, were the skeletons. Human bones littered almost every floor. I didn't know enough to be able to determine what killed all of these people, but it looked like they all died at once. I suddenly realized I'd gotten separated from my friends. Calling out, I got no answer. I started walking through the ruins looking for them, then jogging, then running. Coming around a corner, I nearly ran smack into them. They were standing in the doorway to the largest room I had seen so far, staring in. Annoyed, I pushed past them to see what they were looking at. I found it. The skeletons were intact in this room. I wish they weren't. That way my brain could make up excuses. Most of them were still definitely human. The other ones, though, I don't know what they were. It was as if a human skeleton had been partially molded into that of a coyote. The skulls were elongated, the spine stooped, the fingers clawed. In the center of the room was a jet black pedestal. On it lay another skeleton. None of us really wanted to go in, but we did anyways. Walking towards the bizarre skeletons, I almost tripped over a strange rod. Picking it up, I couldn't tell what it was or what it was made out of. I asked my friends to come look at it. One of them took it and, as a joke, jabbed it into the chest of my oldest friend, Pete. Not expecting the attack, Pete stumbled backwards and tripped, landing on the pedestal. He didn't move again. The guy who had jabbed him walked over to help him up, rod still in hand. As soon as that rod touched the pedestal, there was a flash of a light and a rushing sound. Clearing my vision, I saw that Pete was moving now. He was writhing in pain, and once my hearing came back, I realized that he was screaming as well. The guy who had jabbed him moved to help, but jumped back as Pete rolled onto the floor, scattering bones. As he thrashed, I saw that his body was starting to warp. Then, without warning, he lay still. Looking at him in horror, I realized that his features matched the weird skeletons next to him. He had somehow been transformed. Pete stared up into the eyes of the guy who had, by accident, done that to him. What he did next, I don't like thinking about. It was horrifying, and I ran. Sprinting through the ruined buildings, I heard another person yelp as he went down, then another. Then it was just me and what used to be Pete. Bursting out into the sunlight, I sprinted to the base of the hill. Turning back, I saw Pete standing in a doorway watching me. Before my eyes, his body twisted and shrunk until he just looked like an ordinary coyote. I took a step backwards. The coyote snarled and ran towards me. Whimpering, I turned and scrambled up the hill. The coyote was faster. Much faster. By the time I had reached the top, it was upon me. I could feel its body slam into my back, sending us both rolling down the other side of the hill. Twisting to face the thing, I pulled my arm back and slammed my fist into its muzzle. It yelped in pain. I tried to hit it again, but this time the thing was expecting my blow. Just before my fist made contact with its face, the coyote opened its mouth and bit down on it. Yelling, I smashed my head into it, making it let go. We hit the bottom and rolled apart. Struggling to my feet, I saw the coyote twisting and warping back into Pete's form. He was scratched up and his nose was broken. He was wearing nothing but a coyote pelt wrapped around him. "Jack, please help me," he moaned. I walked over and started to stoop down to help him up. Then I saw his eyes. They were coyote eyes. I started back, and with a snarl he lunged at me. Only now remembering the knife in my belt, I pulled it and stabbed it into his chest. His body shuddered, then went still. I stepped back as his skin began to crumble into dust. It blew away, leaving nothing but a skeleton of human crossed with a coyote. I told the police and the therapist that a madman in the hills had killed my friends. I gave them the wrong location for where it happened. I think those ancient cities died for a reason. That humans aren't ready for that kind of magic that had been discovered in them. The magic that let people transform into those things that I now know are called skinwalkers. I didn't used to believe in magic and monsters and the paranormal, but now I know the truth. I love the forest, and I don't see how anyone couldn't. The chirping of the birds and rustling of leaves drew me like a fly to honey. A poet once said, "Man's soul lie within the trees," and I'd be inclined to agree. Near my home was a national park with plenty of trails, creeks, and caves, a beautiful place in the Daniel Boone National Forest. Long stretches of nothing but nature and its beauty. I never understood some people's fear or hate of the woods until a few months ago. A cold April morning, I was off of work. For the first time in my busy life of the past few weeks, I didn't have to commute to Louisville. I could stay in my small town and enjoy the bachelor life as best I could. I went out onto the trail that morning, athletic shorts and a t-shirt, embracing the cold air rather than being opposed to it. I set out on the paved gravel trail from the parking lot, up past the yellow upon brown sign welcoming you to the National Forest. The parking lot behind me was pretty empty that morning. There were one or two cars, and on the far side, a park ranger's Crown Vic, the ranger sitting on his hood and enjoying a cup of joe. I was glad to know I'd have the trail mostly to myself, and so I broke out on a jog. Earbuds set in and the volume pumped up. The trees breezily shook in the morning air. The sun clouded out. Overcast, maybe rain later. I huffed and shook my head, continuing on down the trail. I passed another jogger at one point, and we shared waves, but I saw no one else for a while. I think half an hour passed, judging by how many songs I'd cycled through, until I came up to Big Bend Fork, a split in the trail leading up two different paths. One path was a little more overgrown, and I'd only been up there a few times. It led past an old grill and bench, along with an abandoned power box shack, which had since been transferred to the other path, my normal one, which went past some campgrounds and a fishing dock. However, to my surprise, a park ranger was there, armed, with what looked like a tranquilizer rifle in his hands. He seemed to be guarding the trail and keeping an eye out. I stopped my jog and took the earbuds out, asking him what exactly was wrong. Luckily, it wasn't anything too scary. A few large bears had been spotted wandering around and upon the campgrounds up ahead, a mother and father and cubs, and they'd ripped up a vacant tent of another hiker. Black bears aren't the most dangerous bears, not at all, but with cubs the parents tend to be highly protective. Better safe than sorry, the ranger told me, and that the trail should reopen the next day when they could relocate the bears deeper into the woods. Another ranger had headed up the second path and reported nothing abnormal, so he assured me it was safe. The path that way was shorter and would probably let me finish my jog before the rain came, but I had no choice. I jogged along the other path and up into the more overgrown part of the park, and hoped the storms would be delayed long enough for me to finish my jogging routine. Another half hour or so along the gravel path, grass starting to overcome it farther on up. It clearly saw some level of disuse, that much was clear. I reached the rusty bench and felt my legs begin to give out. Time for a break. I slowed my pace down and walked off the trail to the bench, taking a seat and giving my body a rest. My head tilted up to the sky, and I shut my eyes, lost in the world of 80s music. I'm not sure how long I sat there, But after a while, I started to smell something. Something wafted over to me, and I couldn't tell fully what it was. It seemed to be coming from farther up the trail, near the power shed. Whatever it was, I hopped off of the bench begrudgingly, stretching out and doing a few toe touches before continuing on the trail. The smell became more pervasive as I made my way further up, and I started seeing some kind of material along the trail. Bits of red, black, and some gray. They were strewn along the sides of the trail in odd patterns. I stopped and picked a few pieces up. Pieces of black hair stuck to them thanks to static. They were pieces of tarp. Maybe from that fence? It would make sense. They continued up the grassy trail towards the distant power shed. Something told me not to check, that it may be the bears, but I knew there was another ranger out here, so I carried on. That's when the smell got worse. The smell got much worse, and I could see red spray on the grass. Reddishness over parts of the tarp leading up to the old, rusty, cream-colored shed building. Breaking off the trail, I walked up to the shack, which itself had a small gravel trail, a sign on the wall reading "Keep Out," rusted and grimy. The smell was unbearable by now, and I could see what it was. Behind the shed, off to the angle I couldn't see from the trail, was a large black body. Hairy, fat, animal-like, and ripped open. Flies massed around it. I clasped a hand over my mouth, holding back the urge to vomit. I got a better view of it as I closed in on the shed. I could tell its face, its skin there. Parts of it were ripped clean off, leaving bone or muscle or flesh behind, but no skin. However, the red trail didn't go to the bear. It went inside the shed. The door was open slightly, and the shed itself wasn't too bad nor too small. It could hold a few power terminals and breaker boxes, and could maybe hold 8 or 9 men standing together. The smell got even worse. Flies buzzed about as I neared the door. Every instinct told me to turn back, and I nearly did, until I heard a chewing noise. A chomping, spitty, chewing sound. A breathing, a shuddering, like a human. I thought someone may be getting attacked by an animal. I couldn't just leave, not if they were in danger. I pressed the door open slowly but surely. Pale light from the outside beaming in, dust particles scattering from it as more of the room was opened up and illuminated. The old power boxes and monitoring systems were dusty, destroyed, long since vandalized and abandoned. The red trail continued, blackened and thick inside the shed, to a dark corner. I could make out a silhouette in the dark, something huddled, or maybe sitting or laying. I couldn't tell. My hand remained over my mouth, the smell absolutely unbearable by now, but I pushed the door further open. The sounds of chewing stopped, and as the wave of light rushed over from the open door, I wish I hadn't been there. A man, but not a man, a humanoid, maybe, sat there. His palms were bloody and bony, bare claws shoved into his fingers where nails had seemingly been ripped off. His body was pale and patchy, with thick hair and what seemed to be fur, some gray and falling out, some black and fresh. As I looked over his, or its, full body, I noticed then what gave me chills to this day. The bear's face was badly plastered over his own skull, his eyes pale and features gaunt. Bits and pieces of the mutilated bear attached to his own body. his nose ripped off and left with a poorly fitting black one of the bear I'd seen outside. Farther in the corner behind him, the unmistakable off-violet uniform of a Kentucky park ranger. His legs, or what was left of them, stuck out, his chest completely torn open and his entrails hanging from the thing's fingers. A look of terror and shock was solidified on his half-eaten face. The thing stared at me, head tilted in curiosity. I was absolutely silent, as was it, like we were locked into some kind of staring contest, like it was looking upon me with the same shock and awe I had looking upon it. Then it smiled, a toothy, bloody grin, its mottled yellow teeth jagged and barely fitting together. My blood went cold. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. But a sudden lightning strike and a rumble of thunder from the coming storm broke the silence, and it startled me. I couldn't help but scream, losing my cool in that one moment. The creature didn't like that. He didn't like it at all. Maybe he perceived me as a threat or as prey, but it let out a howl, an unnatural howl, and it lunged off the floor. I was startled, but I'd been running and jogging since middle school, and as soon as it started moving, I took off in a sprint down the trail and back the way I came, away from the shed, away from whatever the hell was chasing me. But it screamed like a banshee, and it ran like one too. I could hear its footsteps right behind me. I could hear its grunts and screams as it pursued me. I lost all track of time as I ran, all sense of being. Adrenaline rushed through me, and I was on autopilot. I sprinted for what seemed like an eternity until I nearly reached the Big Bend Fork. I looked behind me to see if I could still see it, but I couldn't. I couldn't see anything behind me for the length of the trail. And then I tripped. I fell on something hard but soft, fleshy and squishy, and immediately felt very warm all across the front of my body and my face, warm and uncomfortably slick. I struggled to stand, but my hands only melt something squishy, a mass of wetness and disgusting, slimy surfaces. I sat up from whatever it was and could see only red. I wiped my eyes clean and then discovered I'd fallen onto the corpse of the park ranger. On his back, his face ripped to absolute shreds, his abdomen torn open and half of his torso ripped off. I screamed louder than I ever have in my life and scrambled up to my feet, standing over his mutilated corpse, until I heard that familiar banshee cry from behind me. I looked over my shoulder, and that smell hit me again, the smell of that creature. I then remembered. The rifle, I said, thinking out loud, and looked to the ground. Sure enough, the bloody rifle of the park ranger lay just off the trail. I grabbed it and checked it. It was loaded. And it was an actual gun, not just some tranquilizing tool like I initially thought. Low caliber, but good enough for me. I couldn't check if it was loaded or if the safety was on, but I aimed it up the trail just as that beast of a man was gaining distance on me. It looked more horrific in the open light, and I could see every vein, every patch of mottled and rotted flesh, the blood streaming from where it had attached the mutilated bare parts. I shut my eyes, expecting death to be coming, but I pulled the trigger. A loud crack resonated throughout the forest. I don't know if I hit the thing or not, but I heard a howl and the rustling of leaves. I opened my eyes after a moment and looked ahead. It was gone. Nothing beside me, behind me, or in front of me. The rustling of bushes got quiet until there was absolute silence. Me, with this rifle, standing above a dead man. Utter silence. I stood there like a statue, rifle still aimed, finger on the trigger, and I waited. I thought it would ambush me. I thought it was waiting for me. But another rumble of thunder woke me from this frozen position. Droplets. Then a sprinkle of rain began to fall, and without any further consideration of the situation, I took